What is an institution? And institutions in economics are going to be rules, roles, and ways of enforcing those rules that structure human interaction. So these institutions are essentially the software for society, and sometimes I think this is used incorrectly in everyday speech, or at least it's used in a way that's not the way economists use the term, because some people sort of think of institutions as being organizations, like official organizations, like a corporation. And corporations are certainly institutions, but it's a much broader term. Like the umbrella term of institutions includes things like markets as an overall institution, and marriage. And not just corporations, but the whole corporate eco-structure. We've got the legal system, that's an institution, but so is an individual, say, court, or an individual law body within the legal system. That's also a sub-institution. We've got the institution of journalism, the institution of higher education, and particular schools within the institution of higher education. And then regulatory bodies, of course. So there's lots of institutions that sort of have relationships with each other. There's an ecosystem in some ways of institutions out there. And you can think of this as the software for society, not the hardware, where the hardware for the economic system is going to be the capital, like the machines and the buildings that make up the economy. The people in the economy, that would be more like the hardware in its analogy. And institutions are essentially the software that structures the relationships between all of those people and the capital that they own. Now, when we think about enforcement, we need to think about not just official enforcement, such as a fine or being thrown in jail, but also social enforcements, which are in some ways a bigger part of the economy, where perhaps there's social judgment if you do something that's not expected of you based on a role that's set up for you in an institution you belong to. And those social enforcement mechanisms can include habit, they can include convention, they can include social judgment. So there's values of people that are sort of wrapped up with what are the rules we expect from each other, and how do we enforce those rules based on how important they are to different people and different institutions. Now, in a lot of ways, roles is going to be about enforcement, like who in an institution has the authority to enforce or not enforce, and which roles have which rules. So there's going to be a different set of expectations. Expectations is another really important part of institutions. So we might have different roles with different rules that are going to structure people's relationships. So if we think about markets, there's a buyer and a seller, and there are inherent rules that apply to each one. The seller has to be transparent about information. The seller has to, write up a receipt, things like that. The buyer has to pay up, or they could be legally sanctioned in some way, or socially sanctioned, or both. With marriage, the role is spouse of the other person, and the rules are sort of, you only sleep with your partner, you don't sleep with people outside the marriage unless the two of you agree. You stick by one another's side. If you're sick, you don't just leave them because they're sick or whatnot. So there's a bunch of rules that are sort of built into the institution of marriage through expectations and societal norms, and reinforcement of those norms by practices, such as the ceremony of getting married. You're sort of vowing to uphold what this institution is expected to be. And of course, with marriage, there's both legal enforcement and social enforcement in your social circle. With corporations, we've got roles such as the CEO and the board of directors and the management structure. And of course, the structure of the corporate institution is understood generally by the broader population, even though it may vary somewhat from corporation to corporation. So you've got the bigger institution of the corporate sector and the individual institutions of each corporation. And of course, because cultural expectations and cultural cultural norms are going to play a role in these institutions. Each corporation is trying to shape and form its own company culture and forms its own sub-institution based on that company culture. And this gets at the notion of external versus internal institutions, where internal institutions are inside the human heart and soul and mind. These are sort of the norms and expectations that people will naturally live out in their community. They don't need someone coming in from the outside and enforcing it. Whereas external institutions are going to be externally enforced through the structure that's set up in the corporate structure, sort of the guidelines, the rules that are set up within the corporate structure. And of course, there's a relationship between the internal institutions that people carry around in their heart, which is, of course, a more distributed, less easy to control type of institution, and the more top-down, hierarchical, official institutions. And there's this back and forth relationship between those where if those get too far apart, the institution doesn't function. The legal system, of course, is going to have lawyers and judges and defendants and prosecutors as part of the rules. And there is a institutionally validated set of rules and ways of enforcing each of those rules in its proper place. And of course, this legal system has a function which is to facilitate smoother interactions with people. And that gets at what is the function of institutions? Why do we need these as sort of the ecosystem that the economy operates within? And one of the functions, of course, is limiting opportunistic behavior, where we, of course, don't want to fall victim to other people's vying for their own self-interest. And institutions help structure an environment where each person is protected from that. Institutions also facilitate coordination and trust, and they facilitate smoother interactions between people because people can sort of trust the institutional structure to know this person's going to follow through with what they say they're doing because we know there's going to be some sort of enforcement. I'll get what I expect, and therefore I don't have to worry about this exchange or this relationship I'm forming with that person. Institutions protect rights of the individuals because, of course, with the rules, some of the rules do protect autonomy or certain things that you are allowed to do that nobody can come in and stop you from doing. So property rights are a key part of institutional economics. Another purpose of institutions is that they avert conflict, where humans will naturally get into conflict over a variety of things, and institutions can sort of structure relationships so that that conflict gets resolved more smoothly, so that people don't leave the situation upset over the conflict because they kind of knew the expectations and rules and enforcement going into it. And institutions help to manage the power dynamic between people by setting up expectations and rules and rights. Now, for institutions to be effective, the people who are operating within the institution need to understand what these are. Because if there's misunderstandings, of course, people can be opportunistic saying, "Oh, I didn't know that that was expected of me," or "I didn't know there would be that punishment," and that creates confusion and chaos. So these institutions do rely on sort of what I would call mental infrastructure, like people having in their brains, how does the legal system generally work? How does marriage generally work? What's the structure of higher education? What's the incentives around grades and deans and students and graduation and all that stuff? All of the structure around this, people have to understand it for it to function well. And so the human brain and the human capacity to understand is a limited resource. So there can't be infinite institutions. So they tend to be nested in this way where there's this bigger institutional structure for higher education, which tends to have the same roles across different schools. And each school builds on that mental infrastructure in the population but it has its own unique, perhaps social rules or tweaks on the role of the professor or tweaks on the role of the dean of students or whatnot. So there's kind of nested institutions that build out the shape of the economy.